and on the northern edge of Ashford County, where the paved highway slowly narrows into long rural roads lined with scattered trees and aging wooden fences, and the evening of October 17th began like countless others before it. The sky carried the deep orange glow that settles over the countryside just before sunset, and the wind moved quietly through the tall grass along the roadside. Cars passed occasionally, but the area remained mostly still, and the kind of place where the noise of the town faded into distant echoes long before night arrived. That evening, two men had driven out toward that quiet stretch of road, and their vehicle, a dark gray Ford Explorer, rolled slowly past the last cluster houses before reaching the wide open land beyond the town limits, and inside were Carter Holloway and Mason Riker, two men whose lives had followed ordinary paths for years, and to anyone who might have noticed the vehicle passing through the area, there was nothing unusual about it, and a pair of friends driving along an empty road just before nightfall would have seemed like the most ordinary scene imaginable, and Carter had been behind the wheel as the vehicle moved along the fading road, while Mason sat beside him, occasionally glancing out the window at the distant fields, and the landscape surrounding them stretched wide and quiet, interrupted only by occasional farmhouses scattered miles apart, and the road itself curved gently through the countryside, disappearing and reappearing between low hills and patches of thick woodland that had grown undisturbed for decades, and nothing about the moment suggested the kind of mystery that would later surround it, and the vehicle eventually slowed near a gravel turnout that overlooked a broad field stretching toward a line of distant trees, and it was the kind of place Mason had visited before, a quiet vantage point where the open land allowed the evening sky to spread wide across the horizon, and as the sun began sinking lower, long shadows stretched across the ground, and the wind carried the faint sound of insects beginning their nightly chorus. From a distance, and the scene would have appeared calm and completely unremarkable. The vehicle sat quietly beside the road, its engine no longer running. Beyond it, and the countryside remained unchanged, the same landscape that had stood there for generations. No sudden movement disturbed the field, and no unusual noise broke through the quiet evening air. For a brief moment, everything felt perfectly still, and what happened next would later become the center of a mystery that investigators struggled to explain. Because sometime during that quiet stretch of evening, and something changed. The exact moment of that change was never clearly identified. There was no dramatic sound, no witness who later described seeing anything unusual unfold, and instead, the transition from ordinary to unexplained happened in silence. The road remained empty. The surrounding fields showed no sign of disturbance. And yet when someone eventually came across the location later that night, the scene felt strangely incomplete, and the Ford Explorer still sat in the gravel turnout exactly where it had been parked earlier. Its doors were closed. The keys remained inside the vehicle, and nothing about the car suggested it had been abandoned in a hurry. To an outside observer, and it might have looked as though the driver and passenger had stepped away for only a few minutes. But Carter Holloway and Mason Riker were nowhere in sight. At first, and the discovery didn't immediately trigger alarm. Rural roads often saw drivers stopping briefly to stretch their legs or step into nearby fields, and it wasn't unusual for someone to leave their vehicle for a short walk before returning. But as time passed and no one returned to the vehicle, and the quiet unease surrounding the scene slowly began to grow, the area itself offered few answers, and the open field beside the road stretched wide and undisturbed beneath the fading light. The line of trees beyond it stood dense and silent, and their dark shapes forming a natural barrier between the farmland and the forest that spread deeper into the county. If someone had walked into those woods, and the trees would have swallowed them quickly, leaving little trace behind. But investigators would later find something unsettling about the scene, and there were no obvious footprints leading away from the gravel turnout, no signs that the men had crossed the open field, and no indication that another vehicle had arrived or left during that time. It was as if the moment Carter Holloway and Mason Riker stepped away from that vehicle, and the landscape itself had quietly erased their presence. As darkness settled over the countryside, the empty road returned to its usual stillness, and the wind continued to move gently through the grass, and the distant Ashford County flickered faintly across the horizon. To anyone passing by later that night, and the abandoned vehicle might have appeared like a minor inconvenience on the roadside. But for the people who would eventually investigate the scene, and that quiet stretch of gravel would become the starting point of a question that refused to fade. Because when authorities later examined the vehicle more closely, and they noticed one small detail that immediately complicated the entire situation. Both men had left their phones behind inside the car, and long before the abandoned vehicle was discovered on that quiet stretch of road, Carter Holloway and Mason Riker lived lives that appeared steady, predictable, and deeply ordinary. Nothing in their past suggested that their names would eventually become attached to an unanswered mystery. To the people who knew them, they were simply two men navigating their routines in a town where most days passed without incident. Carter Holloway had built his life around structure. At 34, he worked as a structural engineer for a regional firm that specialized in small municipal projects across Ashford County. Bridges, public buildings, and road improvements filled most of his professional schedule. The work required patience and attention to detail, qualities Carter seemed to possess naturally, and colleagues often described him as methodical and calm, someone who approached problems quietly and rarely allowed pressure to disturb his focus. Outside the office, Carter's routine rarely changed. He lived in a modest home on the southern side of town, in a neighborhood where the houses were older, but well kept, and his mornings usually began early, often before sunrise, when the streets were still empty and the town felt peaceful, and it was common for neighbors to see him walking through the quiet blocks with a travel mug of coffee in his hand, moving at the same unhurried pace every morning, and evenings were typically quiet. Carter preferred reading, working on small home improvement projects, or taking long drives through the countryside where Ashford County slowly opened into wide farmland and scattered forests. And those drives had become something of a habit over the years, a way for him to clear his mind after long days spent studying blueprints and construction reports. And Mason Riker's life followed a different rhythm, though it intersected with Carter's more often than most people realized. And Mason was 31 and worked as a freelance photographer, whose projects range from regional travel magazines to small editorial features highlighting rural communities. And his work required movement, flexibility, and a willingness to spend long hours exploring places that most people overlooked. Unlike Carter's structured routine, Mason's schedule changed frequently. Some weeks he traveled across the state searching for new landscapes to photograph, and while other weeks he remained in town editing images or meeting with local publications that occasionally commissioned his work. Despite the irregular pace, Mason had developed a reputation for capturing quiet moments that felt authentic and unforced. His photographs rarely focused on dramatic scenes. Instead, they often centered on empty roads disappearing into distant hills, fading storefronts in forgotten towns, or fields stretching beneath wide skies at sunset. And editors who worked with him often noted that his images carried a sense of stillness, and as though he had a talent for finding beauty in places most people passed without noticing. And the connection between Carter and Mason had started several years earlier during a community restoration project, and volunteers from around Ashford County had gathered to repair an old railway station that had been abandoned for decades. And what began as occasional conversations between two strangers gradually turned into a quiet friendship built around shared interests. Both men appreciated quiet spaces, and both enjoyed driving out beyond the busy parts of town where the roads narrowed and the countryside opened into long stretches of land untouched by development. And over time they began making those drives together, sometimes stopping so Mason could photograph the changing light while Carter simply stood nearby taking in the silence. And to people who occasionally saw them together, their friendship appeared uncomplicated. There was no dramatic story behind it, and they were simply two individuals whose routines happened to overlap in ways that felt natural. In the months leading up to the night they disappeared, and nothing about their lives appeared particularly unusual. Carter continued managing projects for the engineering firm, and occasionally traveling to nearby towns when construction work required on-site inspections. And Mason remained busy with photography assignments that took him across several counties, though he always seemed to return to Ashford County between trips, and friends and coworkers later recalled that neither man showed signs of stress or conflict. There were no sudden changes in behavior and no troubling events that stood out in memory. Their lives moved forward in the same steady rhythm they had followed for years, but investigators would later discover something about the day they vanished that raised quiet questions, and both Carter Holloway and Mason Riker had cleared their schedules that evening. Neither of them had told anyone exactly where they planned to go, and the morning of October 17th began with the same quiet rhythm that usually defined life in Ashford County. The town woke slowly, as it always did, and with the distant sound of delivery trucks moving through the main streets and the soft glow of early sunlight stretching across rooftops. For most residents, the day carried no sense that anything unusual was about to happen. It unfolded like any other weekday, filled with routine tasks and familiar schedules, and Carter Holloway's day started shortly after 6 in the morning. As usual, he followed the same pattern that had shaped his mornings for years, and a brief walk through his neighborhood, coffee in hand, allowed him to gather his thoughts before heading to work. The streets were still quiet, and the cool air carried the faint scent of autumn leaves beginning to fall from the trees that lined the sidewalks. By 7:30, Carter had already arrived at the engineering office where he worked. The building itself was modest, a 2-story structure located just off the town's main road. Inside, the environment reflected the kind of practical work the firm specialized in. Desks covered with blueprints, computers displaying structural models, and shelves filled with project folders created an atmosphere that felt organized and purposeful. Throughout the morning, Carter worked through a series of routine tasks connected to an upcoming bridge inspection scheduled for the following week. Emails moved back and forth between colleagues, and occasional conversations drifted across the office about construction updates in nearby counties. To anyone observing him that morning, Carter appeared exactly as he always did, focused, calm, and entirely absorbed in the details of his work. Across town, Mason Riker's day unfolded in a different setting, but followed a similarly ordinary path, and he spent the early hours reviewing photographs from a recent assignment that had taken him through several rural communities west of Ashford County, and his workspace was a converted spare room in a small apartment above a row of shops near the town square. The room was filled with camera equipment and lenses carefully arranged on shelves, and stacks of printed photographs pinned to a large corkboard along one wall, and each image captured quiet moments from the landscapes he had traveled through: abandoned barns, empty roads, distant hills fading into evening light. That morning, Mason focused on selecting images that would eventually appear in a regional travel magazine scheduled for publication later in the year. And editing photographs required patience, and he often worked for hours without interruption, and adjusting colors and contrast until each image matched the atmosphere he remembered from the moment it was captured. By late morning, the town itself had fully come to life. The cafes near the square filled with customers, local shops opened their doors, and traffic slowly increased along the main roads leading in and out of Ashford County. Yet nothing about the day seemed unusual or out of place. Shortly after noon, Carter left his office for a brief lunch break. He stopped at a small deli located a few blocks away, and a place he visited often enough that the staff recognized him immediately. After picking up a sandwich and coffee, he returned to the office and spent the early afternoon reviewing structural reports connected to several ongoing projects. Meanwhile, Mason stepped away from his editing work and walked through the town square with his camera slung over one shoulder. And it wasn't uncommon for him to capture photographs of everyday life in Ashford County, especially during moments when sunlight reflected off the older brick buildings that surrounded the square. The afternoon passed quietly for both men, and as the day moved closer to evening, Carter wrapped up his final tasks at the office and prepared to leave shortly after 5. Around the same time, Mason returned to his apartment and organized his camera equipment before stepping outside once again. What happened next seemed simple at the time, and sometime after 6 in the evening, Carter's vehicle was seen leaving the southern side of town and heading toward the rural highway that eventually led beyond the county limits. A short time later, another sighting placed Mason entering the passenger seat of that same vehicle near a quiet intersection several miles away. To anyone who might have noticed them, the moment would have appeared completely ordinary. two men beginning a short drive through the countryside as the sun slowly dipped toward the horizon, but when investigators later reconstructed the events of that day, they discovered something that quietly complicated the timeline, and, for nearly 40 minutes after that sighting, no one could confirm where Carter Holloway and Mason Riker had gone, and the gravel turnout where Carter Holloway's vehicle was later discovered Cyvernet secondary road that most drivers rarely used unless they lived nearby or were intentionally heading out into the countryside. And the road itself curved slowly through miles of farmland before eventually connecting with a narrow highway that cut across the northern edge of Ashford County. And it was the kind of place that felt far removed from the town's activity, a stretch of land where time seemed to move more slowly. For Mason Riker, and locations like this were familiar. Over the years, he had developed a habit of searching for quiet landscapes where the light shifted in subtle ways across open fields, and the gravel turnout overlooked one of those landscapes. A broad stretch of farmland extended outward from the roadside and ending at a distant line of trees that formed the edge of a dense woodland area. During the late afternoon and early evening, and the sun often sank directly behind that tree line, casting long shadows that transformed the entire field into a calm, fading horizon, and it was a place that seemed built for stillness. According to the timeline investigators later constructed, and Carter's Ford Explorer likely arrived at the turnout shortly after sunset began to approach, and the fading daylight would have painted the sky in muted shades of orange and gold, and while the air carried the cool edge of autumn that had settled over Ashford County during the past week, and the vehicle itself would have appeared almost invisible from the road, unless someone drove close enough to notice it. And gravel turnouts like this were common throughout the county and often used by farmers checking nearby land or by travelers briefly pulling over before continuing their journey. And yet something about this particular location would soon become deeply important. When authorities eventually examined the scene later that night, and they found the Ford Explorer parked neatly along the edge of the gravel clearing. There were no signs that the vehicle had been abandoned suddenly. The doors were closed, and the interior appeared undisturbed, and the headlights had been turned off before the engine stopped running. From the outside, and the vehicle looked exactly like one that had been left behind temporarily. But the longer investigators studied the scene, the more unusual it began to feel, and inside the vehicle, several personal belongings remained exactly where they had been earlier that evening. Carter's phone rested in the center console, and Mason's camera bag sat on the back seat, partially unzipped, with several lenses still neatly stored inside, and a jacket was folded across the passenger seat, as though someone had set it aside with the intention of returning shortly afterward, and nothing about the arrangement suggested panic or urgency. If Carter and Mason had stepped away from the vehicle, it appeared they believed they would return within minutes, and the surrounding landscape, however, offered few clues about where they might have gone. The field beside the turnout stretched wide and open, and making it difficult for anyone to cross without leaving visible signs in the grass. Beyond the field, and the dense line of trees formed a natural boundary where the farmland ended and the forest began. Investigators walked the perimeter carefully and scanning the ground for footprints or disturbed soil. Yet the surface of the gravel turnout remained mostly unchanged, and the small stones showed no clear tracks leading away from the vehicle. Even the field itself looked untouched. The tall grass moved gently with the wind, but there were no flattened paths cutting through it, no obvious signs that two men had crossed the land toward the distant tree line. And that absence of evidence would later become one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. And because if Carter and Mason had chosen to leave the vehicle and walk into the surrounding area, there should have been some trace of movement, and even small disturbances in the grass might have indicated the direction they traveled. But the landscape remained strangely undisturbed, and the road itself offered little help as well. Traffic through that part of Ashford County was extremely light during the evening hours. A few vehicles passed occasionally, but most drivers simply continued along the winding road without stopping, and investigators later checked nearby properties hoping someone might have noticed activity near the turnout that evening, and a farmhouse located nearly a mile away sat on slightly elevated land overlooking part of the road, but the residents reported seeing nothing unusual. And The evening had passed quietly for them, just as it had for the rest of the county. As darkness settled across the farmland, and the gravel turnout slowly disappeared into shadow, the open field faded into darkness, and the tree line beyond it became little more than a dark silhouette against the night sky. It would remain that way for several hours, and, when the vehicle was eventually discovered later that night, it immediately drew attention. Not because it appeared damaged or abandoned in a suspicious way, but because it felt strangely incomplete. Everything suggested the driver and passenger had stepped away briefly. Yet neither Carter Holloway nor Mason Riker had returned, and when investigators later searched the surrounding woods the following morning, they discovered something that made the situation even more difficult to explain. And, just 50 yards from the gravel turnout, near the edge of the tree line, they found a small object that investigators could not immediately account for. And, by the time the Ford Explorer was officially reported to local authorities, the quiet stretch of gravel along that rural road had already taken on a different atmosphere, and what had once been just another forgotten turnout overlooking farmland was now the center of growing concern. At first, the situation appeared simple, and two men had likely stepped away from their vehicle for a short walk and had not yet returned. But as the hours passed and the night grew deeper, and the absence of Carter Holloway and Mason Riker began to feel less like a delay and more like the beginning of something far more troubling, and deputies from the Ashford County Sheriff's Office arrived at the scene shortly before midnight. Their initial assessment was cautious but routine, and vehicles were occasionally left behind in rural areas for harmless reasons: mechanical problems, unexpected rides with friends, or simple miscommunication about where someone planned to go. Yet as the deputies examined the vehicle more closely, the situation began to feel unusual, and inside the Ford Explorer, several personal items remained exactly where they had been earlier in the evening. Carter's phone still rested in the center console, and Mason's camera bag remained on the back seat. The keys were still inside the vehicle, and these were not the kinds of things people typically left behind if they planned to travel far from their car. That detail alone raised the first quiet question: and why would both men step away from the vehicle without their phones? At first light the following morning, a more structured search began, and officers returned to the gravel turnout along with additional deputies and several trained volunteers from the county's search and rescue team. And the surrounding farmland and nearby woodland were divided into small sections so teams could move carefully through the area without overlooking potential clues. And the search began closest to the vehicle. Investigators examined the gravel surface again, and, hoping daylight might reveal tracks or disturbances that had been missed the night before. But once again the ground showed very little evidence of movement, and the stones had shifted slightly under the tires when the vehicle parked. But there were no clear footprints leading away from the turnout, and attention quickly shifted toward the field beside the road. Search teams moved slowly through the tall grass, spreading out across the open land in careful lines. And if Carter and Mason had walked across the field, even briefly, the grass should have shown signs of being disturbed. Yet the field remained mostly untouched, and by mid-morning, search teams reached the line of trees that marked the bedding of the woodland area beyond the farmland. And the forest here was dense but not impossible to navigate. Narrow paths formed naturally between the trees, and the ground beneath them was covered in a mixture of fallen leaves and soft soil that should have preserved footprints. Investigators moved cautiously through the area, and marking any unusual findings with small flags so they could be examined later. During those early hours, the investigation remained focused on the most straightforward possibility: that the two men had wandered into the woods and somehow become disoriented after nightfall. And it was not uncommon for unfamiliar terrain to become confusing in darkness, especially in areas where cell phone reception was weak. But, as the search expanded deeper into the surrounding land, that explanation began to feel less convincing. There were still no clear tracks leading away from the vehicle, and no discarded belongings, no signs that either man had attempted to navigate through the forest. Meanwhile, detectives began examining the digital timeline of the day before the disappearance, and Carter's phone records confirmed his final known activity shortly after 6 in the evening, while Mason's device showed similar inactivity after that same period. and neither phone had attempted to connect to nearby cell towers after that time. It was as though both devices, and the men who carried them, had simply stopped moving, and back in town, word of the search began to spread quickly. Ashford County was not a large place, and unusual events rarely remained quiet for long. Friends, coworkers, and neighbors began contacting authorities to share any information that might help explain where Carter and Mason could have gone. Most of the information was routine, and people described their personalities, their habits, and the ordinary schedules they followed in daily life, and nothing suggested either man had been facing personal problems that might explain a sudden disappearance. Yet investigators continued reviewing every detail, and because somewhere within the routine events of that day, they believed an answer might exist. By late afternoon, and the search teams had covered a significant portion of the surrounding area without finding any trace of the missing men. The farmland remained quiet, and the woodland paths showed no clear evidence of movement. Even the nearby roads revealed no witnesses who had noticed unusual activity that evening. But as detectives reviewed the timeline again, one new detail quietly emerged. Earlier that afternoon, both Carter Holloway and Mason Riker had received a phone call from the same unknown number, and neither man had mentioned that call to anyone. And as the investigation moved into its third day, and the disappearance of Carter Holloway and Mason Riker began shifting from a routine search effort into something far more complex, and what initially appeared to be a simple missing persons case was slowly transforming into a puzzle filled with pieces that refused to align. And investigators had searched the surrounding farmland, combed through the nearby woodland, and examined the gravel turnout repeatedly, and yet the absence of physical evidence only deepened the mystery. The abandoned Ford Explorer remained the center of attention, and detectives returned to the vehicle several times, documenting every small detail that might offer insight into what had happened. The interior still appeared undisturbed, and Carter's phone remained inside the center console, and Mason's camera equipment sat neatly on the back seat, exactly as it had been found the first night. Ordinarily, investigators expected missing individuals to take certain essentials with them, phones, wallets, or personal belongings that allowed them to communicate or navigate unfamiliar areas. But Carter and Mason had left behind nearly everything that might have helped them if they intended to walk away from the vehicle for any significant amount of time, and that detail alone puzzled the investigators. The phones became one of the first major clues examined by the department's digital analysis team, and while both devices had remained inside the vehicle, they still contained records of activity from earlier that afternoon. Text messages, brief calls, and location data created a digital timeline that investigators hoped would why the two men had driven towards such a remote part of the county, and the timeline initially appeared normal. Carter's phone showed routine work-related messages during the morning and early afternoon, and Mason's phone reflected several emails connected to photography assignments and editing work. Nothing unusual stood out during those earlier hours, but shortly after 4 in the afternoon, something changed. Both phones recorded a call from the same number within minutes of each other, and the number itself appeared unfamiliar, and investigators quickly discovered it was not saved in either man's contact list. Even more unusual was the length of the calls, and each conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. The calls themselves revealed very little. The number could not be immediately traced to a specific individual or address, and it appeared to be a prepaid phone registered through a service that allowed users to activate temporary numbers with minimal personal information. And, while such services were not illegal, they often made it difficult for investigators to determine who had placed a call. And that discovery raised the first significant question. Why would both Carter and Mason receive calls from the same unknown number within such a short period of time? And detectives began exploring the possibility that the calls were connected to their decision to leave town that evening. If someone had contacted them earlier in the day, and it might explain why they later drove toward that isolated road outside Ashford County. Yet another strange detail complicated the timeline further, and phone data indicated that after those calls ended, both Carter and Mason briefly searched the same location online, and the search results showed a map of rural roads north of the county, including the very stretch of land where the Ford Explorer would later be discovered. and investigators could not determine why they searched that area. Neither man had previously visited the location, and at least not according to digital records or conversations with friends and coworkers, and it was simply a quiet stretch of farmland that rarely appeared on anyone's daily route. The more investigators examined the timeline, and the more unusual the sequence of events appeared. 2 unknown calls, a sudden search for an unfamiliar rural location, and then a drive that ended with an abandoned vehicle and 2 missing individuals. Meanwhile, another detail surfaced when Mason's camera bag was examined more closely, and inside the bag were several memory cards containing photographs from previous assignments. Most of the images showed landscapes Mason had captured during the previous week, and quiet roads, barns, and distant hills beneath autumn skies. But investigators noticed that one memory card slot inside the camera was empty, and, according to Mason's usual workflow, he rarely removed cards from the camera until he returned home to transfer the images to his computer. And yet the card that would have been used most recently was missing. No one could explain where it had gone. If Mason had taken photographs at the gravel turnout that evening, and those images might have been stored on that missing card. The thought raised a troubling possibility. Somewhere, and there could have been photographs capturing the moments just before Carter Holloway and Mason Riker disappeared. But the camera contained no trace of them, and, as investigators continued reviewing the clues, the pieces of the puzzle seemed to drift further apart rather than closer together, and every new detail suggested movement toward that quiet rural location. Yet nothing explained what happened after they arrived, and just when detectives believed they had uncovered the most unusual aspects of the case, a new report arrived from a resident living several miles away, and late that evening, someone had noticed a second vehicle slowly driving along the same road where Carter's Ford Explorer had been found. As the days turned into weeks, and the search for Carter Holloway and Mason Riker gradually shifted from an active rescue effort into a complicated investigation, and the fields surrounding the gravel turnout had been combed multiple times, the nearby forest had been searched in expanding circles, and in every accessible path within several miles of the location had been examined by investigators and volunteers. Yet despite the scale of the effort, and the case produced no clear answers. With physical evidence limited and no confirmed sightings after the evening they disappeared, and investigators began exploring a range of possible explanations. Each theory attempted to make sense of the same set of strange facts: the abandoned vehicle, and the missing memory card from Mason's camera, the unexplained phone calls earlier that afternoon, and the quiet rural location where the trail had seemingly ended. And the first possibility detectives considered was the simplest one. And perhaps Carter and Mason had intentionally stepped away from the vehicle for a short walk and become disoriented in the surrounding woodland after nightfall. And rural forests could become confusing in darkness, especially in areas where paths were faint and landmarks looked similar in every direction. And if the 2 men had wandered deeper into the woods than they realized, it was possible they had become lost. At first, this explanation seemed reasonable, but the more investigators studied the terrain, the less convincing it became. The woodland near the gravel turnout, while dense in places, was not particularly large, and search teams had covered the area extensively within the first 48 hours of the investigation. If Carter and Mason had remained somewhere within those woods, and it was unlikely they would have gone unnoticed during the initial searches. Another theory focused on the mysterious phone calls both men had received earlier that day, and detectives considered the possibility that someone had arranged to meet them at that rural location. And the timing of the calls and the subsequent search for the area on their phones suggested the location had not been chosen randomly. And if the 2 men had driven out there expecting to meet someone, and the situation might explain why they parked calmly at the turnout and left their vehicle without signs of urgency. And they may have believed they were stepping away briefly to speak with someone nearby. Yet this possibility introduced a new set of questions, and if another person had been present, why had no witnesses seen them? The rural road was quiet, but it was not completely deserted, and occasional drivers passed through the area during the evening, and nearby residents occasionally traveled along that route. Still, and no one had reported seeing Carter or Mason speaking with anyone else that night. The report of a second vehicle seen in the area added another layer of uncertainty, and the witness who had mentioned the vehicle could not provide a detailed description. The sighting occurred from a distance, and by the time the witness thought the vehicle might be relevant, the moment had already passed, and investigators attempted to track down the vehicle through traffic cameras positioned on nearby highways. But the rural road itself had no surveillance coverage, and without a license plate or a clear description, the possible connection remained frustratingly vague. And another possibility detectives quietly explored was the idea that the disappearance had been planned in advance. Voluntary disappearances, while rare, were not unheard of, and in some cases, individuals intentionally left their lives behind for personal reasons that only became clear much later. But Carter and Mason did not appear to fit that pattern. Both men had stable routines, ongoing work commitments, and no financial activity suggesting preparation for sudden travel. Their bank accounts remained untouched after the night they vanished, and neither had withdrawn unusual amounts of money in the days leading up to the disappearance. The more investigators reviewed their backgrounds, and the more difficult it became to imagine either man choosing to vanish without explanation. And there was also the unresolved mystery of the missing memory card from Mason's camera. If Mason had taken photographs during their final moments at the turnout, and those images could have captured something investigators had never seen. The possibility that the memory card had been removed intentionally raised uncomfortable questions. And did someone else take it? Or had Mason removed it himself before something unexpected happened? And each theory seemed to solve one part of the mystery, while creating new problems somewhere else in the timeline. Weeks passed, and the investigation continued, but the distance between the known facts and the missing answers only seemed to grow wider. Detectives reviewed every piece of evidence again and again, hoping that one overlooked detail might finally reveal what had happened on that quiet evening in Ashford County. And then, nearly a month after the disappearance, investigators received a small piece of information that forced them to everything they believed about the case. And the unknown phone number that had contacted both men earlier that afternoon had suddenly become active again, and time has a way of slowly reshaping even the most unsettling events. In Ashford County, the days continued to pass as they always had, and traffic moved through the town square each morning. Farmers worked their land beyond the outskirts, and the quiet rhythm of daily life gradually resumed. And yet beneath that routine, the disappearance of Carter Holloway and Mason Riker lingered in a way that never fully faded. And what had begun as an urgent search eventually settled into a long investigation marked by unanswered questions. Weeks turned into months, and the intense early attention surrounding the case slowly gave way to something quieter. Search teams stopped returning to the gravel turnout, and police vehicles no longer appeared along the narrow rural road. But the mystery itself remained exactly where it had started, and investigators continued examining the case long after the initial search ended. Detectives reviewed every piece of information they had gathered during those early weeks, and phone records, witness statements, digital timelines, and the physical evidence recovered from the vehicle were studied again and again in the hope that something small might have been overlooked. And yet the central question never changed. What had happened after Carter Holloway and Mason Riker stepped away from their vehicle that evening? And the abandoned Ford Explorer remained one of the most unsettling parts of the investigation. It represented the final confirmed moment in the timeline, and the last place where the two men had unquestionably been present. Everything discovered afterward existed only in fragments of speculation, and the phones inside the vehicle had stopped receiving activity shortly after 6 that evening. The mysterious calls earlier that afternoon still had no confirmed source, and the missing memory card from Mason's camera had never been located, and the small object investigators discovered near the tree line during the early search, and something they believed might have belonged to Mason, offered no explanation for where the two men had gone next. Over time, detectives attempted to revisit the unknown phone number that had contacted both men on the afternoon of October 17th, and records confirmed the number had briefly become active again weeks after the disappearance before disappearing once more from the network. And despite extensive efforts to trace the signal, investigators were unable to determine who had been using the phone, and it remained one of the most frustrating loose ends in the entire case. Without that missing piece, and every theory investigators considered continued to collapse under closer examination. If the two men had chosen to walk into the nearby woodland, and there should have been evidence of their movement. If they had arranged to meet someone at the rural turnout, that person had vanished without leaving any trace behind. And if their disappearance had been planned in advance, there was no financial or digital activity suggesting preparation. Every possible explanation seemed incomplete, and for the families of Carter Holloway and Mason Riker, the unanswered questions proved far more difficult than any confirmed outcome might have been. And in many missing person cases, time eventually reveals something, a discovery, a witness, or a piece of evidence that changes the direction of the investigation. But in this case, the silence remained. The gravel turnout where their vehicle had been discovered slowly returned to the quiet obscurity it had always known, and drivers occasionally passed the location without realizing its significance. The surrounding farmland continued to shift through seasons of planting and harvest, and, just as it had long before the disappearance. Yet among investigators who once worked the case, the memory of that evening still carried a lingering sense of uncertainty. And because despite all the searches, interviews, and analysis, the most important moment remained invisible. And, somewhere between the time Carter Holloway's vehicle stopped along that rural road and the moment it was discovered hours later, and something had happened that no one could explain. The final confirmed trace of the two men existed only inside the quiet space they left behind. A parked vehicle, and two phones resting where they had been placed, and a stretch of open countryside that offered no answers. Years later, the case remains officially unsolved, and investigators still keep the file open, hoping that one day a new piece of information will surface. A witness who remembers something overlooked, and a discovery somewhere beyond the farmland that changes the direction of the investigation. Until that moment arrives, and the story of Carter Holloway and Mason Riker remains suspended in the same silence that began on that quiet evening in Ashford County. And because the truth of what happened after they stepped away from that vehicle has never been found. And somewhere between the last moment they were seen together and the silence that followed, the answers disappeared with them. And the disappearance of Carter Holloway and Mason Riker remains one of Ashford County's most unsettling mysteries. And what began as a quiet evening drive ended with an abandoned vehicle and two men who were never seen again. Despite searches, investigations, and countless theories, and the moment they vanished still cannot be clearly explained. Every clue uncovered only deepened the uncertainty rather than resolving it. Years later, and the road where their vehicle was found remains unchanged, silent, and ordinary. Yet for those who know the story, it represents the final place where their trail ended, and somewhere between that ordinary evening and the silence that followed, the truth disappeared with them. If this story left you with questions, you're not alone, and mysteries like this remind us how many stories remain unsolved. Share your thoughts and theories in the comments. What do you think might have happened that night? And your perspective could bring a new angle to the discussion. If you enjoy deep mystery documentaries like this, and make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next investigation. And if this case intrigued you, and explore our channel for more real stories where the truth is still waiting to be discovered.